Good evening, everyone. Today I'll be doing the prediction for the GC N-level Science Biology paper. Before we look at the possible questions that may appear in 2022 paper, let's take a look at what came out last year. In the MCQ section, components of cell, ribosomes, concept of diffusion and osmosis, food tests, biological molecules, metabolism of amino acids, in particular, the function of liver, the purpose of photosynthesis, the adaptation of root hair cell, and the understanding of translocation were tested. Other than those mentioned, blood vessels, including hepatic artery, hepatic vein, hepatic portal vein, renal artery, renal vein were assessed. So students need to know the function of each blood vessel. Where were they located? Where do they transport blood from and to? They need to be familiar with the different blood vessels, vein, artery, and capillary. How do they look like? How are they different? Vein has a thin muscular wall with a larger lumen compared to artery. Artery had a smaller lumen with a thicker muscular wall. Capillary has only a one cell thick wall, which shorten diffusion distance for exchange of substances between the blood and the cells. Students need to be familiar with the direction of flow of blood in the circulatory system. They need to know where do the blood flows from to. Students need to be very familiar with the gaseous exchange in alveoli and the role of the film of water or moisture in the alveoli. Reactants and products in aerobic respiration as well as anaerobic respiration were also accessed. Students need to understand what asexual reproduction means based on the diagram given in the question, where the offspring has identical genetic makeup as the parent. Students need to show some understanding of nuclear fission. Transfer of pollen grains were tested, where students need to know where do the pollen grain transport from to enter to stigma. In sexual reproduction system, students need to be very familiar with the labeled diagram. Where does each organ position at and the functions of the organ. A question on the causes of HIV was also accessed, where students were required to look at the graph and understand that when sterilized needle was introduced, the HIV cases dropped. So questions in the N-level paper were no longer so direct, and they test all the learning objective in the syllabus. So there was a good spread of questions based on the learning outcomes in the syllabus. Those objectives tested in the multiple choice were not replicated in the structured. A good range of questions covering every topic for the N-level syllabus. So it was a well-taught paper with questions and content that were not familiar in other years. For example, renal artery or renal vein. In the structured questions, the questions were more or less quite standard compared to previous year, just that in this year paper, we realized or noticed an increasing trend of graphical database question in a simpler manner compared to the pure science. So students were required to interpret graph and relate data, but it's very straightforward. Just that I feel that the questions are more creative and use more real life data to connect the real world data statistics to what they're learning in the syllabus. So it makes the learning of biology more relevant and applicable to real life and current affair. So in the structured questions, they were tested on the labeling of structures in a cross-section through a leaf. So it was quite a standard question where they need to know the parts in a leaf tissue, the tissues involved in the leaf organ, the cells and the tissues in the leaf. Okay. They need to define what transpiration is. And there was a question where they need to interpret a graphical presentation of percentage of smokers over the years and list the benefits of not smoking. So it's a very interesting question because instead of saying why smoking is harmful, the question asks it in another way. What is the benefit of stopping smoking? So the answer is similar to the harmful effects of smoking, just that students need to rephrase in such a way to answer the question. So I would say that the question was creatively set. Components of blood, red blood cell, white blood cell, and platelets were tested, including drawing the diagram of red blood cell to show that it is biconcave, circular with no nucleus. Students need to understand how temperature and pH have effect on enzyme activity and of course explain the lock and key hypothesis. The word equation of photosynthesis, organelle, and substance to trap light energy were also tested. So the usual type of question. And as usual, explain how light intensity affect the rate of photosynthesis. Now, there were questions on the function of hepatic portal vein, the digestion of starch and protein. Students need to know the enzyme, substrate, and the product involved. A question on the effect of blocked fallopian tube was tested. How does it affect fertilization and hence prevent the person from getting pregnant? And students need to be very clear the hormones that affect menstrual cycle. What are the hormones involved in the menstrual cycle and at which part of cycle did they increase in concentration? So in all the popular topics in the 2021 paper were cells, which came out in the MCQ, diffusion and osmosis, MCQ, enzyme structured, human nutrients and digestion, MCQ and structured, since it's a very big topic, plant nutrition, both MCQ and structured, transport in human, likewise, transport in plant, likewise, respiration. For asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction in plants appeared in the MCQ, and sexual reproduction, both MCQ and the structured. So my prediction for the paper this year may not be an accurate one because I believe most of the LO will be tested. Okay, because just like what I shared in the chemistry N-level paper, there were not many topics in the syllabus already. So there is a limit to how much learning outcomes they will cover. So it will likely be replicated. However, I do have some prediction and some important learning outcomes for students to take note of that they must study. I'm not saying they will come out, but because they didn't come out that much or never come out at all in the 2021 paper, do be prepared that they will come out. But what I also predict is there's an increasing trend towards database question where students need to interpret graph, table, and compare data. That is a very clear trend of doing so. And the questions are no longer so direct. This is a trend now where the examiner or the setter will try to bring in real life context. How do you bring in real life context? Database. Okay, so students are expected to compare data. For example, there was a question on 2021 paper about how the percentage of smoking, okay, increases over the year, something like that. Okay, I think it's a graphical presentation of percentage of smokers in Singapore. In previous year, there were questions on smoking as well, about the impact of smoking on the damage of the lungs, something like that. Yeah, so it shows how at different age, okay, the extent of damage changes. So students need to be prepared for such questions. So do look at the 10-year series and try to do these questions and be ready to handle database question where they need to use relative term, need to code data and code and use the data value correctly and relate it to the content that they learn in the syllabus. Okay, so other than those I mentioned, do take note of database question. For cells, there could be a question that where students are required to compare animal versus plant cell, or they may just give a cell when they ask them that, okay, then this cell cannot carry out respiration. Why? So maybe lack of mitochondrial, something like that. Okay, or this cell couldn't carry out photosynthesis. Why? Because there's no chloroplast to, not enough, cannot just say no chloroplast, must say no chloroplast to trap sunlight, converting light energy to chemical energy for photosynthesis, during photosynthesis to make glucose. Okay, diffusion and osmosis, do pay attention to the explanation part. So there is no such question last year in the structure. So bear in mind, it may appear this year, where students need to explain how diffusion and osmosis affect the following: plasmolysis, crenation, bursting of animal cell, or turgidity of plant cell. Any one of these will be tested. So it will be a database question where they were given maybe the length of the potato or some other substance, or the radius of the cell, and they ask them why does it increase, why does it maintain the same, or they even ask them, they may give a graph, they may have a graphical question, then they ask you, okay, which concentration of salt solution is the potato is. So when you look at the graph, is where the graph intersect the x-axis, where the concentration of the salt in the cell and the surrounding solution is the same. So when they are the same, there is no net movement of water molecules, so no osmosis take place. So the cell does not expand or decrease in size along that line. Okay, it will not be a direct question. It will be something like the past paper, but different. Okay, so bear that in mind. Enzyme, I will not say much because it was tested. But if it ever come out, just get ready lah. So they may ask about the process. Okay, instead of asking them how temperature has an effect, they may ask about a general process about how the enzyme active site binds, how the substrate binds to the enzyme active site, and so on. Okay, to form the substrate enzyme complex, blah blah blah. For human nutrients and digestion, do pay attention to food tests, the exact description, how do you carry out the various food tests, the organs and the accessory organs like pancreas, liver, blah, 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 how are they involved in the digestive system. So there could be more focus on the small intestine, large intestine, stomach, mouth, yeah, and villi, absorption and assimilation. Do pay attention to that. Plant nutrition, I will not say much, but do know the parts lah. Like they may ask question about labeling and where's the pelacyte, where's the spongy mesophil cells, blah, blah, blah. And maybe ask questions like why there are more chloroplasts at this part of the plant tissue. Maybe something about xylem and phloem also, vascular bundle. Transport in, oh sorry, that should be under transport in plant, apologize. But for plant nutrition, maybe more like other factors that affect the rate of photosynthesis. Okay, like maybe amount of light energy was tested, right? The light intensity. So they could ask something about carbon dioxide. I don't know. Or maybe they will ask about comparing two plants, like how do you know which one has a higher rate of photosynthesis? Based on the number of bubbles of gas, which is oxygen, something like that. Okay, it came out before. Transport in human, the parts of heart, where are the ventricles, atrium, and the blood vessels that connect them. And the valve, yes, and the valve. Where are the valve? Labeling the valve, okay, very important. And comparing thickness of wall between blood vessels, how clotting of blood takes place, and basically, yeah, a bit of the blood pressure also, take note of that. Transport in blood, stoma, gut cells, transpiration, and vascular bundle, yes, I mentioned that. Respiration, adaptation of alveoli, chemicals in cigarette, this is not really tested, so carbon monoxide, all other irritants, tau, and so on, nicotine. Okay, go and study them. Role of liver in oxidation of lactic acid. Asexual reproduction, I think the focus will be more on pollination, cross and self-pollination, and fertilization. That one was not tested at all, so pay attention to that. One more for sexual reproduction, I think just study as per normal. Know the parts, functions, menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle this time around may just come out in MCQ. I'm not very sure. So my last advice is study all learning outcomes, and seems the scope is not a lot. All right, so that's about it. Thank you. Hope this will help.